Hello and welcome back to Perspectives. On today's show, we report on the growing corruption and violence spreading in the Punjab. Not from its population, but believe it or not, within its police force. And India just can't seem to help itself as it faces yet more accusations of political interference in Canada. Meanwhile, Donald Trump's administration releases a report detailing its concerns about its unacceptable trade balance with Narendra Modi's nation as tariffs loom large. So we take a look at the likely direction of those negotiations. And as sexual assault against women runs endemic across Indian society, we look at historical roots of misogyny in the country that are inextricably linked to the evils of the country's caste system. A system that once forced women to pay a tax unless they allowed upper caste men to see their breasts in what became known as the breast tax. Well, all this and more on today's show. But joining me as always for Perspectives is our very own correspondent in Canada, James Cousineau. Good morning, James.
Good morning, Angus, and good morning to our amazing viewers out there. Just a quick one to start off. We got a nice letter from Honorable Dylan, who is a senator in Canada. So it seems like we are getting feedback, not just from our viewers, but also from a senator here in Canada, just complimenting the show, which is also complimenting our viewers because you're such a big part of it. So remember to keep your comments coming and be a part of our program with us. We love it. Thanks again, and back to you, Angus.
Absolutely. James and I breaking through into the political sphere at last. And of course, today we'll be bringing you our perspectives on the daily news affecting the Sikh community across the world. And we'll take a look at your comments at the end of the show, as always. So thank you for sending so many of those. Right, James, let's get going. What are you going to start us off with this morning?
We're going to start off outside of the Senate and more towards the election that's coming up here in Canada in just 4 weeks' time. And of course, we know that we have talked this past year at great lengths about the foreign interference from China, from Pakistan, from Russia, and of course from India, and it doesn't seem to be letting up. Now, new reports are coming out that there are more allegations that India has souped up the engine, so to speak, and they are revving at full RPM when it comes to using AI and other bots to try and interfere with the upcoming election here in Canada. Now, just recently as last week, the Globe and Mail newspaper also reported about the confirmation from the Canadian Intelligence Service that there was interference in the leadership campaign for the Conservatives in 2022, which of course saw the placement of Pierre Poilievre in that leadership race. Now, there is no evidence showing that he or his caucus were actually aware of the interference, but it seems like it is continuing now with a lot of money being raised within the South Asian community, within the extremist Hindutva groups and so on and so forth, as well as, of course, directly on behalf of the India government to influence the outcome of the upcoming election on the 28th of this month. So we're going to watch very closely as to how this happens. And there were also rumors that came out that that Justin Trudeau had delayed the leadership appointment and race in the Liberal Party that just took place due to confirms and scrutiny about the foreign interference potentially being involved there. But of course, that's being denied, and that it is a non-story according to the Liberal Party at this point. And of course, we also know that Jagmeet Singh has not escaped suspicion either, with rumors of foreign funding swirling around his grassroots campaign. So it seems to be touching all three of the major parties here in Canada. We are watching it very closely as to how this is going to play out, what's going to happen with the upcoming election. But we know that the Canadian elections, they are well aware of the foreign interference risk that is very real right now, and they are taking a big step towards the investigation and the monitoring of that election. Now, some people in a recent poll actually reacted in a mix of anger and almost just ambivalence to what's going on. And the recent poll, 62% of Canadians expressed concern about foreign interference, yet only 45% believe the government can stop it. And retiree Linda Chen of Vancouver has stated, "We've seen this movie before," she says. "The 2021 election had the same rumors and nothing changed. Why should we care now?" And of course, there's a lot to care about when it comes to maintaining the dignity and democracy of this nation. So it is very important. Toronto student and activist said that if foreign powers can pick our leaders, what's the point of voting? So it shows that some people are just getting very frustrated, and it's almost taking the air out of their sails at the point where they are able to get out and vote in the federal election this year. We need to really watch what's going on. And as potential voters, for all of the Canadians out there watching, be aware of what you're seeing online. We know that there are already evidence that's been caught with false images, AI-generated images, as well as many other fake news stories and other things that are perpetrated by the RSS, by RAW, by foreign actors, and so many others. So again, you just got to use some common sense, but research. And that is all I can say when it comes to being aware of the potential interference, Angus.
Yes, this forthcoming election, and gosh, hasn't time suddenly moved quickly? It's only 4 weeks away to this crucial election. And it has all the ingredients, really, of so much potential for interference, misinformation and influence, because, of course, there is so much at stake for so many stakeholders in this election. Of course, just domestically in Canada, you've got the right against the left. But of course, India has a massive stake in this because, of course, firstly, there is the large Sikh population in Canada, of which a large part clearly are very pro-Khalistan. And that has seriously, evidently, really concerned Narendra Modi. You only need to see the extent to what measures he's prepared to take. He's prepared to send his hit squads to murder a high-profile Canadian citizen just to try and quell the Khalistan movement. So clearly, Narendra Modi cares about India, cares a lot about India and the internal politics. So it would be absolutely no surprise if India weren't involved behind the scenes at very deep, dark, dirty levels trying to influence this election, because, of course, the Liberals have stood up to Narendra Modi. They've been one of the very few nations on this planet, I have to say, one of the very few governments who've actually had the courage to stand up absolutely black and white, with no ambiguity, for human rights, not just of its own citizens, but for the diaspora citizens that have fled India in fear. Of course, I'm referring to the Sikh community. Is that Justin Trudeau stood up to Narendra Modi publicly and called him out for what he did, which actually is more than any other nation has done, I have to say, despite there being quiet alliances. So Narendra Modi does not want the Liberals back in power. He'll be terrified that a successor to Trudeau follows that same political stance against India. Now, Mark Carney, bit of an unknown quantity, we will see. But, of course, Poilievre, we do know, and most of his cohorts in the Conservative Party clearly are pro-India, pro-right-wing India, which by extension is a benefit to the RSS. And, of course, therefore, India will be doing their level best to get the Conservatives back into power. And as we do know, we know that this election is tight. It really is down to almost single percentage points who could win this election. And that means that it could only take something relatively small to tip that balance. And I suspect, James, that India will be throwing everything they've got to try and tip the balance in the favour of the pro-India party, which is clearly the Conservative Party. And I think we need to watch very carefully. This is a very tightly fought election. It could very easily go to the Conservatives, who only recently were leading so massively in those polls. And I think India will be trying very, very hard to ensure that the Conservatives get back into power.
Absolutely, Angus. And I just wanted to bring up this one last paragraph here to close that off, is that the government insists it's prepared. The Elections Canada Modernisation Act, passed in late 2024, it bolsters cybersecurity and mandates real-time reporting of suspicious activity. Now, because that was brought in late 2024, we're now in early 2025, there hasn't been the time to really follow through on the Hogue inquiry, which we covered earlier this year, or last year. And that was the call for a dedicated foreign interference watchdog. So again, I'm sure that will be something that is taken into account before the next election. But for this one, it just is it's just too soon. And to close that off, the RCMP do have a hotline. If you suspect foreign interference or election meddling, you can call that. And they have already received over 1,000 calls since January, Angus. It's just insane. So yeah, it is surprising the number of activities that have been reported so far this year alone. And it just really gives pause to thought how many go undetected and how many happened during the last election. But with that, Angus, we better move along to my next story or we're going to run out of time once again. And we're going to look at a story that was suggested by one of our viewers in our comments section. And that has to do with the current situation of the Punjab Police Force and the overwhelming amount of corruption and violence and such that's being alleged against that police force. Now, this is a force that has a very storied history. There has been a lot of accusations that have happened, especially when you go back to the 1980s and 1990s, and then it seemed to quiet down somewhat and calm, but now it appears that not only is violence an issue, but corruption itself. There has been a slew of police officers who have been suspended, who have been arrested, and who have been the subjects of of the FIR reports for law enforcement. This has gone as high as the Chief Minister's office, where there have been assistants to the higher-ups that have been charged, and others who have just been going wild when it comes to the corruption and also the amount of violence that's taking place within the police detachments. Now, unfortunately, the police in India, they are very undermanned. So I believe it's around 114, 117 officers per 100,000 residents. So that is a very low police presence. When you couple into that issue the fact that there is little training and they're inadequately resourced, it really adds a lot of stress to the officers on the front lines. When you combine that even further to the fact that the courts are so backlogged because they don't have enough resources there either to actually prosecute not just regular criminals, but the police officers who are being investigated and charged with crimes. So it's a frustration all the way around. And unfortunately, it leads to shortcuts being taken. It leads to officers feeling that they are not being watched and held accountable. So it's easy for them to slip thousands of rupees into their pocket and look the other way when it comes to certain activities by gang members, by drug dealers, by even some of the politicians, I would imagine, are very much involved as well. And as I said, it goes very far up, and even as recently as October 2024, when Sub-Inspector Mandeep Singh faced similar charges over a bribery scandal as well. And this is not just isolated missteps by certain officers and certain inspectors and sub-inspectors. This is a very rampant issue that's getting worse and worse as we go. And it's not going to change until they actually start to really deal with the proper training, when they start bringing in more officers to be able to handle the number of calls and the pressure. And of course, when the courts catch up and are able to actually process these cases within a timely fashion. Now, with those shortcuts that I was talking about, police are using torture methods to get information. They are beating suspects. They are participating in suspected organized disappearances. And it's just insane. One recent sweep actually caught 52 police officers in a single sweep. That is a big sign that they are cracking down, but at the same time, it's too little too late for some who are saying that the police have been involved in all of this activity and that it's a whole culture that needs to be changed. And when you take it from a systemic issue and failure by the state or the federal level to fund the police and to make sure they have enough resources, officers, and training. And now to take that to the next level where it becomes a culture. That takes a lot longer to change, and it takes a lot more resources to basically make that change, because you have to really start looking at weeding out a very large percentage of the force. And with timelines and overlapping, it takes a long time in turn to bring in new officers and to try to defeat that whole mindset of corruption. And when they look at recent activities, and there was a colonel and his son who were allegedly beaten, and this happened, leaving him with a broken arm. And people are saying that, if a colonel of the military is not safe, what hope do ordinary citizens have? And that is a very common fear and feeling and sentiment within the community, and it's not the right sentiment to have. Now, we know that the India government is spending all of this money on the space race, or, get to Mars, or whatever their space program is about, and spending money here and there in the millions of dollars, while turning a blind eye to the poverty in many communities and also the lawlessness that happens. And unfortunately, with that lawlessness, a lot of it is targeted towards the minority communities. And that, again, creates more of political upheaval. It creates more civil tension and violence as well. And it's just a cycle that needs to be broken, that it needs to be fixed. For any of our viewers who are actually in India, in the Punjab, there is a helpline number on the screen. And that there in the story just is a line that you can call now for public complaints about the police service. They've also moved to an e-FIR system, which means the initial police reports, you can start filing for things such as auto thefts and nonviolent offenses. And that helps to free up police for more pressing matters. But at the same time, when you are looking at a police force that is so out of touch with the community in terms of having any faith, trust, and presence, any type of relationship with the community, then it's going to be a long path ahead to break down on that corruption, to break down on the violence, and to break down on the illegal activities by the police force. And you couple that into communities where they have gang problems with drugs, with violence, with rapes, with all of these different issues, and then to have the police playing a hand in the wrong side of the law, it just really makes it, unbearable for the community, Angus.
Yes, it's such a deep shame, this, not just for Punjab, but I think primarily for India. Now, the history of the police force in Punjab, as we've often talked about, back in the 80s and the 90s, is pretty shameful. I mean, that's an understatement. The extrajudicial killings at the hands of the butcher of Punjab, KPS Gill, were just a national disgrace. And again, that's an understatement. But there's no excuse for it now, really, and you have to look at the root causes, and I think you've probably touched on most of those root causes there, James. I think basically this comes from the top down. Any nation that has endemic corruption is essentially due to the top down problem. It starts at the top and then it cascades down. Because if you're just a lowly citizen and you see those in the hierarchy above you acting corruptly, you think, oh, that's okay, it must be the way we do things. In other words, it is systemic, as you said. It is systemic in Indian culture to be corrupt, and many of our commenters often say how corrupt India is, and this is the problem. So, in other words, the root cause lies at the very top. Of course, it lies with the government itself. The government is up to its own corrupt, nefarious activities, which then cascades down to law enforcement, and law enforcement think it's okay. Well, the politicians are doing it, so we're okay to do with it, etc. And down it goes down to the lowly citizens. The other problem, of course, is the growing wealth gap, which again we talk about regularly, James. The growing wealth gap is creating a huge underclass of people in India. And of course, they're literally fighting to put food on their tables, to keep a roof over their heads. So of course, they'll do anything, literally anything, to do that. And if you're a police officer on low pay, you're actually pretty much the same boat, but you have at least the advantage of being able to secure money, bribes from people around you to do that. So again, it all comes back to the root cause is that again, the governance of India is failing because it is growing this problem. People feel the need to do this. And the other bit that I find particularly unforgivable, because what I've just explained there is understandable. It's reasonable if you are a deeply poor Indian. Of course, you'll literally do anything just to survive. So that explains that. What isn't explained is the torture cells. And we do know, and certainly from many of my podcast guests who've attested to this, is that every police station, certainly in the Punjab, has a torture cell. And we've seen evidence of people who've been brought in and tortured. That isn't corruption. That is just pure badness. That's evil. That's a human nature problem. That means the people who wear those uniforms, who torture people, whether it is a police officer or whether it's just a low caste individual, that is just sheer evil. There's no excuse for that. There is no explanation other than that you have bad genes. That's the bottom line, and that to me is unforgivable, James. So yeah, this has, as you say, it needs a culture change. It has to come from the top down, and I lay the blame squarely on the government, sadly.
Absolutely, Angus, and let's face it. I mean, just last fall, we were talking about a young lady going into a police station to report a sexual assault, and was sexually assaulted again by the police officers. I mean, the level at which this corruption and this violence and this criminality by law enforcement is just totally on a whole different level than what we would expect to see in any so-called democratic and civil nation. And yeah, a lot more has to be done about it.
Indeed. Okay, well, let's move on to my first story. And again, we're talking about India as a nation. And Donald Trump, there's been a lot of publicity, obviously, about Donald Trump's commercial strategy in bringing in tariffs. I want to quickly go through the United States Trade Representatives, which is an organisation, an internal organisation that reports on country by country every year on the commercial situation between the United States and that country. And of course, India features large in this report. It's a huge report. It's over 400 pages. India occupies many pages, unsurprisingly. And of course, it does highlight this terrible trade imbalance between India and the United States, of course, to the benefit of India. Donald Trump's recognised this and he wants to do something about it. So quick analysis of this. I'm just going to do a quick rundown to save you all reading 400 pages of dry, boring commercial stuff, and I'll summarise it very briefly. So, okay, step one, talking about establishing the basis for Donald Trump's tariffs. Now, obviously, agriculture features large here, and the agricultural subsidies in India has distorted the market massively. Of course, these minimum support prices, the MSP for staples like rice, wheat and sugar, have created a huge amount of artificial competitiveness, which, of course, is directly harming American farmers. High tariffs on US products coming in. India imposes excessively high tariffs, up to 150% on key US exports, like alcohol, cars, motorbikes, apples, walnuts, amongst many other agricultural commodities, which of course significantly harms US exporters. And then the non-tariff barriers. India routinely employs restrictive licensing, arbitrary customs valuations, and non-transparent import restrictions. In other words, it just arbitrarily just imposes bureaucracy and whatever, just to slow down the imports from America. And this is on areas like pharmaceuticals, ICT products, that's technology, and medical devices. And it creates an uneven playing field for US companies. So, strategic targets likely for US tariffs. Unsurprisingly, rice and wheat feature the big agricultural staples. India is the world's top rice exporter, of course, primarily down to its subsidy-driven artificial pricing. And of course, don't forget the farmers' protests in the Punjab were deeply linked to a lot of these problems. US tariffs on these exports could offset India's competitive advantage, forcing India to reconsider its subsidies. Now, under pharmaceuticals and medical devices, a huge area, India's restrictive licensing and price controls severely limit US market access. So they are reducing the amount of US exports of this area into India. Imposing tariffs on India's pharmaceutical exports could create substantial leverage for negotiating reciprocal market access. In other words, we'll let you in if you let us in. That's a likely direction of that. And then when we come to technology, given India's import restrictions and licensing barriers on these products, like, for example, laptops, servers, and just general technology, reciprocal tariffs, that means tariffs from both sides, on Indian manufactured technology goods could rebalance negotiations in favour of American interests. So, the actual levels and implementations of these tariffs. Well, if we implement phased tariffs initially at a moderate rate, for example, a fairly low rate, maybe between 10 and 25%, and then scale it upwards progressively, it makes India focus on this issue and say, look, if you don't change the way you're doing business, India, we will just keep scaling it upwards. In other words, it forces India to take these remedial actions. Prioritising tariffs on products subsidised by India's MSP programs, that's the minimum support pricing, MSP programs, and sectors significantly protected by high Indian tariffs to maximise economic and political leverage. So again, it's very targeted and it will be prioritised against certain areas. And employ selective tariffs rather than blanket measures, ensuring minimal collateral damage to US businesses and consumers. So in other words, it's a bit more of a sniper rifle rather than just a shotgun. We'll just blanket tariff everything. Anything that's coming from India will put tariffs on. In fact, they're going to be very targeted against very specific goods and products and services. Negotiating strategy that will likely be employed and what they call an exit ramp. In other words, how do we get off this situation, get out of this situation? Explicitly link tariff removal to India's actions on reducing or eliminating agricultural subsidies, lowering import duties to globally competitive rates, dismantling non-transparent import licensing requirements, ensuring compliance with World Trade Organization transparency rules, and utilise bilateral trade dialogues and WTO World Trade Organization forums aggressively to underline the fairness and reciprocity of US demands. So basically what that summarises is to say, look, we'll just keep these targeted tariffs on Indian goods to try and change India's stance on it, change its behaviour, to reduce these barriers basically. And in the public domain, we will say, look, we're only doing this because it's fair. And the strategy will be, in terms of its PR, its public relations from an American perspective, we're saying, look, this is only fair. If you look at the facts on both sides, India is acting unfairly in this trade balance. We are just bringing things back to a fair and a level playing field. So, and then the final sort of area that they looked at is the strategic communication and public messaging, which again relates to this, is to emphasise this fairness principle. It's to highlight how India's protectionist practices, and of course we've talked regularly about how Narendra Modi has adopted this isolationist, this protectionist stance for India. But it's to highlight how India has been using these practices to negatively impact American workers, farmers and innovators. And then to frame these tariffs as defensive. They're not aggressive tactics, they are defensive. They are necessary measures to protect American interests and restore reciprocal trade fairness. So again, this is all about MAGA. This is Trump once again saying, look, well, I have been elected to protect American interests and that's what I will do. So it follows that same theme. And then also to stress the openness to negotiation. In other words, we're not just imposing this because we can. We're open to negotiation. Come and talk to us. Let's get rid of these tariffs for both of us so we can have a level playing field and both enjoy this relationship. And then the strategic tariff approach combines economic pragmatism, it's basically practical, and assertive negotiation, in other words, firm but fair negotiation. Adhering to principles championed by key Trump-era trade strategists aimed squarely at rebalancing the trade balance between the two nations to protect and advance American economic interests. So basically, in lots of very big, complicated words, this report basically says, look, we just need to impose some very carefully targeted tariffs on India, just to give India a message saying, look, you've got to stop this approach, this Narendra Modi tactic of ironically, it's make India great, but that is to the expense of American exporters. And America's saying, look, we want to make our nation great too, but if we both adopt this, we both lose. Let's just come to the negotiating table. Let's open the borders to each other's producers, and that benefits both nations. It makes India great again, and it makes America great again, Jez. It's all about fairness.
It is, and unfortunately, I think that where some of the message is being lost is the fact of the tariffs being used to try to balance out the trade worldwide, but also seen as a way for certain areas of the Trump administration to penalize or to act out frustrations on other governments by throwing the tariff words around. And it really takes a lot of the power out of the whole purpose of the tariffs is to balance trade in interest to regain some of the market that they've lost. And when I say they, I'm referring to the U.S. So I think that coupled with ongoing trade talks, whether that's free trade agreements or just reciprocal trade agreements that are not free trade agreements, I think that there has to be a lot more done in that regard as well. But again, it's, when you look at the farmers issue in India, it has been a very, very tough time for farmers over the past decade. And, even over the last several years, it's been, just propagating up and just growing exponentially. So it's time that something is done for both sides to try. And at the end of the day, it's about supporting the farmers who are feeding us, and they deserve to be making a reasonable living. They can't go broke and be struggling themselves, and for us to expect them to continue to do that so that we can eat.
Of course, Punjab will be directly affected by this in both negative and positive ways. Negatively, because of course the Punjab is the breadbasket of India, and the farmers in the Punjab is, of course, they are out protesting on a daily basis because of how they've been poorly treated by their own government. But what they do need, ironically, is, well, first of all, they don't need American exports of grain and rice and what have you, because that will impact them. But what they do need is American technology. They need American investment. And American companies are lining up to invest in Punjab agriculture. And it's the money, actually, ironically, that the Punjab needs. So it's pros and cons on that one. Anyway, James, let's move on now as the clock marches on. And I'm going to change subjects totally now. To quite a shocking discovery I've made about a little snippet of Indian history, and it actually relates to Kerala down in the south. I was sent a very interesting video, quite a shocking video actually, that hit TikTok. I'm no fan of TikTok. I don't understand it more than anything else. But this video hit TikTok, and it was sent to me. Just take a look at this.
In the early 1800s in Travancore, India, there was a breast tax put on women by this king who wanted to keep the lower castes down. Breast tax was known as mulakaram. The lower caste women were expected to keep their breasts exposed, and if they refused to go topless, they were given a tax. The amount of tax to be paid depended on the size of the tatas. Once the lower caste women attained puberty, the tax would start. And it was the high caste men who collected the taxes from topless women. Have like breast police to ensure their compliance. They would go house to house to just look and see if women were covering them up or going commando on top. Standing bare-chested in front of the higher class people was considered a respectful thing to do. And if you covered them, you were trying to tell people that you had money. Eventually, a woman was so upset that she performed her own mastectomy in front of a tax collector, which then all, broke loose. And a few years later, the breast tax was discontinued.
Okay, I saw this video and I thought, oh look, TikTok, it's full of these sensationalist, over-dramatic, clickbaity type videos. And I thought, surely that can't be true. Maybe there's a snippet of truth. So it did actually prompt me to do a little bit of digging. And as we often say, one of the attractions of the Sikh community and Sikhi as a philosophy is its treatment of women. And we often do talk about these dreadful sexual assaults that occur. They're endemic in India on a regular basis, gang rapes, dreadful attacks against women. And of course, those are rooted deeply in history, in India, generally speaking, in Indian history. And this misogyny that's grown through Indian society is absolutely shocking, and it's unforgivable, particularly in the lens of the modern era. And yet, as I say, the one attraction of one of many attractions of Sikhi is its treatment of women. Women, from the very first guru, as he broke away from Hinduism and broke away to create the philosophy of Sikhi that then evolved into what it is today. It wasn't just dismissing the caste system, it was primarily treating women as equals, which in that day and age was actually quite unusual. And ever since then, of course, the female part of humanity has been treated with the deepest respect and, of course, the deserved equality. Unfortunately, that has not been the case, still is not the case in India, and of course this runs way back historically. And of course, this situation, this breast tax, as this lady referred to, did indeed exist. So I did a bit of digging, a little bit of research. So here's a little bit of history. It was, as she rightly says, called mulakaram, which literally translates as breast tax. It was a tax, a poll tax, imposed on women belonging to Nada, Ezava and other lower caste communities by the erstwhile, that's the former kingdom of Travancore, which is in present-day Kerala state. It was not applicable to upper caste women, and the term breast tax was used to primarily denote the gender of the person and not breast per se. Now, it was, according to the police, the breast tax was imposed on lower class women if they covered their breasts. Now, the belief has been questioned, as lower class women at the time were not allowed to wear upper garments in public until 1859. Now, do note here, it's inextricably linked to the caste system, and this is really where I think the true story lies. Now, in those days, in the 19th century, in this kingdom of Travancore in current Kerala, all persons from the lower caste were expected to pay this poll tax when they started work around the age of 14, as that TikToker said, around the age of puberty. Poll tax was also paid by men, but it was called talakaram, which literally translates as head tax, or mishakaram, which translates as moustache tax. And the tax paid by women was then called mulakaram, which is the breast tax. So it was discovered also by the BBC. They reported about 10 years ago on this story. And they reported on a series of paintings by an artist on the legend of Nangeli. Now, the legend of Nangeli is about a woman who, again, this TikToker referred to, who lived in those times in Chitala in Travancore, and she allegedly cut off her breasts in an effort to protest against the caste-based breast tax. And according to that legend, she did this, and then she presented them to the tax collector in a plantain leaf, and then subsequently, unsurprisingly, died of blood loss. Now, how true that is, it's hard to obviously to corroborate, but that is the story that has come through. But these beliefs have been questioned as a breast tax. Because actually at that time, lower class women, what is factual about this? We don't know about that specific breast tax and that incident of the woman. But what we do know is that lower class women were not allowed to wear upper garments in public until 1859, after what was called the Chanar Revolt. Now, this Chanar Revolt, this is where the facts do enter the equation. Now, the Chanar Revolt, let me tell you about the Chanar Revolt. It was also called the Maru Marakal Samaran, and it refers to the fight between 1813 to 1859 of Nada climber women in Travancore who fought for the right to wear upper body clothes, basically to cover their breasts. So, in 19th century Travancore, bearing of one's chest to higher status people was considered a sign of respect by both males and females. Well, according to the upper caste. This applied to those of the lower status caste, such as Nada climbers. Even women of other dominant castes, like the Nairs, had to keep their breasts bare in the presence of Brahmin men. That's the key here. In other words, everybody below the Brahmins, every female below the Brahmins was expected to bare their breasts to Brahmin women. If they didn't want to do that, they had to pay a tax. Ouch. The Naya women in Travancore were allowed to dress as they pleased by royal proclamation. Brahmin women bear their breasts only in front of the deity. So the Brahmin women don't need to bear their breasts in front of men, only in front of their gods. Now, this changed when Christian missionaries entered the equation. Of course, they then educated the women and indeed the men, saying, look, this is not right. This practice must be stopped. Higher class women covered both breasts and shoulders with a piece of material known as the upper cloth, unless in the presence of people of still higher ranked communities. In other words, this caste system meant that if you met somebody of a higher caste, off it comes, unless you pay this tax. And so the Nada women successfully campaigned finally to be allowed to cover their breasts. And of course, the British were involved in this. The Christians, when the Christian missionaries came in, and they essentially educated enough people to finally prevent this. And interestingly, and this brings it up to the modern day, and the Indian Education Board, the CBSE as it's known, when Narendra Modi came to power in 2014, 2 years later, the Education Board issued a circular to all 19,000 schools under it, asking that a section called Caste Conflict and Dress Change, a chapter that included this Channa revolt, be omitted from the curriculum with effect from 2017. So let's take a look at this story from a bigger picture. Basically, the Brahmins in the 19th century said that all women had to show their breasts to men, to Brahmin men. If you don't want to do this, you pay us money. I mean, again, okay, it's one thing to show it through the lens of modern day sensibilities, but just the basic principle. This is at a time, don't forget, when the Sikh Empire exists, when women in the Sikh Empire were not exposed to this horror. They were treated as equals. They were treated with respect. Yet, over in India, in Kerala state, as it is now, women had to, under this caste system where the Brahmins ruled, as they do today, lower caste women had to show their breasts to Brahmin men unless they paid money. Again, I find it quite almost, I'm speechless trying to relay this. And yet, this is so shameful, and modern day India recognised this as so embarrassing because it's also linked to the Brahmins, that the Brahmin government of today said, ooh, we better hide this fact. Let's just omit it from the curriculum. Let's remove it. Let's rewrite history because it actually shows up the evils of the caste system. It shows up what the Brahmins got up to in the 19th century. And one wonders what the Brahmins get up to in the 21st century. We do know because we call it out on a regular basis. But there you go, James. I find this whole story not just horrific. It just shows and demonstrates, again, not just how evil the caste system is, but how it pertains and remains today, because the Brahmins are still, even though they're not forcing lower caste women to bare their breasts, they're trying to hide and bury the truth of the caste system, because this was inherent in the caste system. It proves the power and control of the ruling upper caste that they had over the lower caste, and that same control persists today, James. It's absolutely shocking.
It is breathtaking, and I say breath.
Nearly got you there.
And no, I mean, to think that was acceptable back in that time, I just can't even fathom that. You know, I think of my sisters or my mother or my grandchildren, and to think that they could have been subject to such a thing. I mean, if they were in that era and that situation. But yeah, again, it just boggles the mind, Angus. I can't wrap my head around that.
It is. And once again, as I said, just to remind people, this was at a time when the Sikh Empire was existing, was succeeding. Maharaja Ranjit Singh, he was presiding over a nation that treated its women as equals. You would never get anything like this in a Sikh nation. And it's no surprising then that, for example, as we often jokingly say, that AI, if it had to pick one religion for the world, Yeah, it's no surprise that Sikhi comes top of the list because, again, even when I mean, the British are no angels. Of course, we were up to all sorts of bad things, but we never stooped to these sorts of levels. But even back in the 19th century, when many nations were still so, relatively speaking, backward, socially backward, including the rest of India, the Sikh Empire wasn't doing this. The Sikh Empire treated its women with 21st century standards of respect. And this is 200 years ago, James. So again, it just shows and highlights why we just inherently understand and believe and support the concept of khalistan, because it is rooted in these sorts of basic social principles which have stood the test of time, James. It's very clear cut to me.
Absolutely, Angus, you're absolutely correct on that. And again, it just shows a whole different mindset of a different era, I guess, when you look at how they were, forced to behave in such ways that are just so unacceptable.
And indeed, and we wonder why sexual assaults against women in present-day India is so prevalent. It's because this sort of misogyny is just deeply, systematically embedded in Indian society. And this is what Narendra Modi must get on top of. He must stop it. This just does not belong in the modern world. Right, James, on that moralistic note, let us move forward into our comments section. Loads of great comments. As always, thank you to all our commenters. And we'll start off with one of our regulars, Danny. Thank you, Danny, for all your contributions. And thank you specifically for this one. You pointed to General Samar Singh Toor, who led a contingent of 400 Indian soldiers against 6,000 in Africa, South Sudan. Real Spartans, as you say. Well, I had to look this up. I didn't know about this General Singh Toor. And unfortunately, there is so little information in the public domain about this. I did find a tiny little bit, and I'll just quickly tell our viewers about Major Samar Pal Singh Toor. He's a third-generation Indian Army officer. He was commissioned into the Indian Army's bravest regiment, as he claims, the 8th Rajputana Rifles in 2011, and he was deployed in a United Nations peacekeeping mission. So this is recent in southern Sudan, where the country was going through political turmoil. He served in that mission in South Sudan, where he witnessed bloodshed, fought against thousands of rebels. Of course, Sudan going through a terrible civil war, who were attacking the UN base. And then as a result, he was conferred with the Chief of Army Staff's commendation card. So he was awarded medals for his heroic stance. So thank you, Danny, for that. Unfortunately, we don't have any specific details. Maybe I'll try and dig a bit deeper. But we, of course, James, we always salute soldiers, brave, courageous soldiers, whether they are Sikhs or whether they're even Indian Hindus. We don't care. We will always salute, as indeed every soldier in any nation will always salute a fellow soldier who demonstrates courage and bravery in any situation, James.
Absolutely, and people protest soldiers all the time, but they have to keep in mind that soldiers sign up to give their life and literally their life to country. And they don't sign up saying that they will defend the nation if they agree with it. They instead sign up saying, we will follow the orders as given to us to protect our nation. And yeah, it's something that you have to respect about these people that give so much of themselves without asking for almost nothing in return.
Exactly right, and that is an important distinction. The armies of any nation, particularly in the West, the army is a tool of the politicians. They do what the politicians tell them and order them to do. They might not like it, but they just do it. So often the army, unfortunately, the military gets blamed for all sorts of things, when in fact it's the politicians who are at fault. The army, as you say, are just doing what they are told to do and what they are paid to do. So anyway, let's move on. Stuff to muffins. We talked about the banning of Easter here in the UK by a certain school, and as you rightly say, that your family celebrates Christmas with your children, but we also know these days are of great sorrow for Sikhs. But as you rightly said, you don't stop your children celebrating Christmas. Why should you? Exactly, because of course Sikhi respects the right to practice all other religions. And the problem is when children study in religious schools. That's why I never put my children in a Sikh school. And this is interesting because there are some Orthodox, Sikhs who affect the mind of children. And here in Leicester, this is here in the Midlands of the UK, where we do have a large Indian diaspora and a large Sikh diaspora, You feel how Gujarati people are now under RSS influence, doing discriminatory activities and using these organisations against the local population. So even here in the UK, in the Midlands, we are seeing RSS influence spreading its evil tentacles, which is quite concerning. Minorities, even in hospitals, if they see a man with a turban, they never treat him as he should. Please see this matter. Absolutely. Well, if we ever see discrimination in anywhere, in any social context, we will, of course, highlight it out. But again, I think the worry here, as Sufty Muffin said, is that the RSS are even managed to get their tentacles, even in our own diaspora populations here in the UK, James. They're everywhere.
Absolutely, and it's no different here in Canada. I mean, it is a sad reality that there is so much racism in the communities, and we like to think that it is not there. But again, anybody who says that their community is racist free is just a liar, or really just blinded themselves to it. So for everybody to stand up, stand together, and just honor and support each other, to have that freedom to worship whatever religion is in their heart, then that should be it.
Absolutely, and anyway, a big shout out to our viewers and our audience in Leicester, in the Midlands, here in the UK. A big hello to you guys, and thanks for your support. Dulaisk says this duplicate Sikh who's been pretending to be a Granthi and has been stealing charity money should be put in jail for a long term. Yes, James, this is that story you brought up of that priest, or this alleged priest, who dipped his hand. Didn't just dip his hand, he took large buckets and ran away with an extraordinary amount of money. Now, as you rightly say, Dulaisk, this guy does belong in jail for a very long time. But as part of our educational journey, James, I had to look up this word Granthi. Let me educate those who might not be aware what a Granthi is, and I had to check just in case it was a rude word, and it's not actually. A Granthi, in the context of Sikhism, is a ceremonial reader of the Guru Granth Sahib Ji, the Holy Scriptures, and leads worship services in Gurdwaras. But it's important to note that Granthis are not considered priests in the traditional sense, but rather religious officials who are dedicated to serving the community and propagating the teachings of Sikhism. Well, clearly this guy, James, was not practicing any Sikhi principles when he ran away with a life-changing amount of money.
Absolutely, and I mean, just the faith and the trust that he breached of the people who gave so much of themselves to support the Gurdwara and the community. Oh, it just breaks my heart to see that type of thing happen.
Yeah, deeply shocking, particularly as there were donations from the community. It's again, right. Well, words fail me, as they often do in such a case. Jagtar Sidhu, this is when we go back, winding the clock back to history, as we commonly do, and particularly back to the days of empire. In fact, this is pre-empire. We are Sikhs, not Hindus. Absolutely right, and we say this over and over again, despite the RSS trying to perpetuate this myth that Sikhs are Hindus. Of course they're not. Sikhism is far more closer to Islam than Hinduism. That's why the fifth Guru Sahib asked the Muslim saint to lay down the first brick of the Golden Temple instead of a Hindu Brahmin. So that in itself was a very symbolic act. And don't forget, the Brahmin kings attacked on Sri Guru Gobind Singh Ji 12 times, while the Mughals only twice. So what you're saying is the Brahmins actually back in the day were by far the larger enemy of the Sikh community, than the Mughals were at the time, who were at the time supposedly the traditional enemy. Absolutely right. And in fact, ironically, it was the Brahmin kings at one stage, if I remember my history correctly, who, when they were attacked by the Mughals, came begging to the Sikh population, said, "Look, will you please help us?" Because of course the Sikhs had their missiles, their militia, who were extremely powerful and effective fighting forces. It was the Brahmins who came to the Sikhs and said, "Look, please, can you help us fight the Mughals? We're losing against the Mughals. We need you." So again, the dynamics has such it drips in irony, James.
It does, doesn't it? And yeah, it is just a sad state that people cannot, again, it just goes back to, just letting people live their lives and, and being honest about it and not, trying to oppress everybody else.
And it does, it just highlights actually that this division between the Brahmins, the upper caste of India, and the Sikh population, they are diametrically opposed. They forever will be, as is evidenced by this comment. They have always been completely on opposite sides of the equation. It is unlikely that they will ever find peace between them, essentially because the Brahmins realise it is the Sikhs that are standing up to them. They are the only section of society, really, who are publicly standing up against their control of Indian society. That's really why they will forever be enemies. Now, Danny returns with, I had to put this in because bless him, Danny really does his best. Good luck with your Khalistani rants. Well, thank you, Danny. We do our best. If it happens, India wants Punjab-sized India landmass in Canada, USA. Hand it over. I think your comment here, Danny, which I think is maybe slightly tongue-in-cheek, is saying, look, if Khalistan is to happen and it's carved out of India, then India wants an equivalent size out of Canada or the USA. Well, I think you miss really the democratic principles there, Danny. I think in reality, if Punjab is carved out of India, it is because basically the Punjab is traditionally Khalistan. When we go back to the days of the empire, it's always been there. It has always been Khalistan. It's only changed hands into the control of the Brahmins since 1849. But they want it back. This is not about actually appropriating land overseas. So I think the fundamentals of your argument, I get your point, Danny. I think you're just trying to make a bit of a provocative point, but in reality it doesn't stand up to the test of logic in reality.
Yeah, they can have Quebec.
In fact, there must be huge areas of Canada that nobody lives in, so well, I'll just take that. Nobody wants it. It's such a big country. What's the population of Canada? Is about 5 million or something, James?
Population of Canada?
Yeah.
Is about 40 million.
40 million. So actually, relatively speaking, it's minute in such a huge land. So plenty to go around.
Yeah.
Right, 05 AAB. This is, I think this is a classic case of if you flatter us enough, we will put up your comment because we are that indulgent, James. Good afternoon, Angus and James. What are you doing for? What you're doing for us, the Sikhs, is beyond words. One day in the history of Khalistan, you two will be on a pedestal as the same great Sikh warriors. I think 5 AAB. Thank you, and I think that is deeply flattering, and I really don't think you really mean that because there's absolutely no way that James and I really deserve a place on the same plinth as great Sikh warriors. But I wouldn't mind being on just a little plinth down at the bottom, James, just to recognise what we've been up to.
Well, for this fat ass, it would have to be one hell of a big pillar. So let's just go with a table, a chair, and a nice lunch.
Absolutely. I think we will. Well, actually, 5AEB says there will be statues of both of us on the border of Khalistan and what's left of Hindustan. As you rightly say, James, I would be quite happy with our designated table in the cafe in the capital of Khalistan on that day when it happens, James. I'll be happy sharing a cup of chai across the table with you.
And we'll do that live online so that the world can watch.
We will have microphones in front of us broadcasting the first live show of the Khalistan Broadcasting Corporation. And as the final comments wrap up, Sukha Singh, Scythian Jat both say Khalistan Zindabad. Surjit Kondal says, hi James and Angus, thanks and God bless. Well, God bless to you and all of our audience. And Tanjaban signs off with just 2 simple love hearts. Well, that is what we send back to our wonderful audience, our loyal audience. Thank you for sticking with us. Thank you for sending in so many wonderful comments. Thank you really for just keeping us going, James. It is our audience that really make this show.
Absolutely, and that's why I wanted to share that little letter from Senator Dillon there, because yeah, it's a group effort, not just everybody at Satledge, but of course the audience as well.
Indeed it is, and that really just brings us to a convenient close for today's Perspectives. But Thank you to our audience. Do keep those comments coming in, even especially the flattering ones. Now, I am joking, but do keep those comments coming in, particularly the interesting ones, the historic ones, as we say. We do love researching loads of these stories. There's some fascinating history that we do love to bring out, and that does actually have an impact, a direct impact on even present day India and Punjab. So it's always interesting looking at those, how those stories have evolved into today's society. But don't forget, you can of course message us directly at message@satlodgetv.com if there's anyone you want to bring to our attention directly that you don't want to put in the public domain. But do keep it coming. Thanks so much for watching. We'll draw things to a close again. It is a goodbye from me, a goodbye from James.
Stay safe, everyone.
You have of course been watching Perspectives. We will see you next time.